Hey folks, it's Claire from Impactful People. I'm joined today by Amy. Amy, welcome. We love it if you could give us a bit of an introduction to yourself.
Thank you, Claire. So excited to be here. My name is Amy Pagett. I have been in the HR space for 15 years, went out on my own last year, and I am really working on helping mid-sized companies articulate why anyone would want to come work for them or stay working for them. So I help HR marketing departments work together. They're not enemies. They can work together to help the recruiting and retention experience in those mid-sized companies. So that's what I do. And I'm talking a lot about the topic that we're going to discuss today. So I'm excited.
Awesome. Me too. I think it's a really hot topic for people post-COVID, all sorts of different things that have been happening in the world, but particularly that attracting the right people to your business. And I think a lot of that is about how you put out there who you are to bring in the right people. So yeah, loads we can dig into there. But the area we're really going to focus on is Gen Z, which I know also is a very, very hot topic. So I'd love to start with absolute basics, like who are Gen Z and why should we be thinking about them?
So Gen Z, the typical definition is they were born in 1997, and it hasn't been the end hasn't been defined, at least to my knowledge. So they're it's kind of bleeding into this Gen Alpha, and we're going to figure out when that ends. But starting in 1997, so these are people who only know a world full of technology, and they experienced a pandemic in very formative years for them. And so typically generations and the way that generations are defined are based on these pivotal events or cultural shifts that really help kind of put a beginning and an end to what we would define as the generations. And so that's really the world that they know, and they're coming into our workforce.
Fabulous. And that's really why managers should be thinking more, and leaders, about this group and this generation, because they are the future of the workforce, really, the people that will be building their teams with them moving forward.
Absolutely. I think I read that this year will be the first year that there are more Gen Z in the workforce in Western countries than there are baby boomers. So it was projected that this year will be the year. So your workforces are getting into the Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z. That's becoming really the meat, I guess, of what your workforce can be seen as. And so really important to understand how these generations kind of look at work, look at life, but then how they can potentially work together. And that is the thing the mystery, that is the puzzle that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've touched on this a little bit when we've spoken before, but what you don't want to do is create a culture just for one generation. It's got to be that multi-generational workforce and how you bridge the gap. So I think that'd be great for us to dig into a little bit more. But I'd love to start with what is different about Gen Z? How do we need to think about them differently? And particularly when it comes to attracting them towards your business and retaining them within your business?
Yeah. So when I think about Gen Z and what they're really, really looking for, what would be the thing that would attract a potential Gen Z employee to you? I kind of think of three things, and there's many things, but to focus on three things. The first is going to be offering career growth, career opportunity, and professional development. They're looking for an environment that helps them grow professionally. And that could be in a variety of ways. You've got a robust learning and development program, fantastic. It could be a mentorship. That is something that's very accessible. It can be informal. It can be easy. So it doesn't have to be this overblown thing. Really, they're just looking for a place that will help them grow and learn as they move through their lives. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be flexibility and inclusivity. And flexibility can look a variety of ways. I think there is misunderstanding, and data shows this, that Gen Z does not want to come into the office. They refuse. Actually, they prefer hybrid work environments. There was a statistic that I read that just 11% of Gen Z is looking for 100% remote compared to 34% of other generations. So I think really checking the stereotypes of what we're thinking about this generation and how they work and live is really, really important. But they're looking for flexibility. They're looking for an employer that acknowledges that they're a whole person, that they don't check their personal lives at the door. Like, let's throw that out.
Yeah.
So flexible schedules and a diverse environment. They grew up in a society, their understanding, their education, they grew up in a diverse environment. So the idea that you wouldn't have that feels very foreign. And so I think diversity is something that they're expecting. And I think the word expectation is important. You're moving toward it, fine. You have different ways that you're incorporating that, but a Gen Z employee is just expecting that that's going to be there already. So that's a challenge for many employers. We're trying to get more diversity, and what does diversity even mean? And so that's a whole different, that's another podcast.
Yeah, definitely.
They're looking for diversity, and they're also looking for policies and programs that acknowledge the inclusivity. They're looking for policies that may not even apply to them, but apply to their coworkers, that they want to see that they're being seen by their employer. And again, it doesn't have to be something flashy. It doesn't have to be something that's overthought. It's that you see me in that moment of my life, and you have something that supports me in that journey. So I think that would be the second thing, is flexibility and inclusivity. And third would be regular and effective feedback, communication. Like, let's throw the annual performance review dinosaur out the window. They don't need to hear what you think of them on an annual basis. They're expecting just a consistent and effective dialogue about how they're doing, because they really do want to perform.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be the third thing that employers can really focus on, is how are we communicating to them what our expectations are and how they're doing.
Yeah, I think, well, it's not just Gen Z, is it? I think that's a real movement at the moment. And another topic we'll be covering very soon, actually, on here around performance management. But I think that's really interesting. The thing you mentioned around the stereotypes, I think, is really, really important. And like you said, just checking yourself, looking at the data and what's it telling us. Because I think your first point on career growth is a really interesting one as well. In terms of that, I think there is this mentality that people just want to come into a business for a couple of years and they want to move on. And we are out of the world where people go to a business for, 20 plus years, or in a lot of cases, that's not the norm. But I think that focus on what you can get out of that experience, whether it's 2 years or 5 years or 20 years, however long it is, what you can get out of that experience in that time. And I think it's really important that businesses and managers are thinking about that, like, how do they take people on a journey? So when you think about retention of employees, what do you think good retention looks like? And that might be a punchy question to ask, because it might be business dependent, but are we saying that people should be staying in businesses for 5 years, or is it about keeping someone in the business for the length of time that makes sense for that individual and for that business?
Yes, to all of it. So I think first is redefining what a successful retention of an employee is. The days, like you said, of being at a company for 20 plus years, those are gone. So let's throw that dinosaur out the window also. I think if you can provide the career development and the flexibility, and you provide an environment that a Gen Z or any employee, it's productive for both the business and for them. And then when that time runs out, and it will, and that's not a failure necessarily, because it has to make sense for the business that employee continue, and it has to make sense for the employee that they continue in the business. So I think there is a value in the idea that employment can run its course, that you provide what makes sense for your business at that time to to employees. And then when they outgrow, they don't have another position to go to, your business is such that there just isn't that opportunity, you part ways, and that's not a bad thing. So I think redefining in our minds what successful retention is. In my mind, if you have somebody for 2 to 3 years, you have succeeded in the retention game. And anything you get beyond that is consider it bonus. Consider that you have an organization that supports additional growth that makes sense for employee, makes sense for business.
Yeah.
So in my mind, that's how to approach retention today.
Yeah, I really like that. It very much aligns with kind of my values as well. And I like that idea of celebrating the progression. Like someone outgrowing your business should be something like you've helped that person grow and develop in that time. They're taking all the things that they've learned, which used to feel like a threat, right? People are like, oh, they're taking all the things they learned with me and going somewhere else. You should be able to celebrate that and acknowledge that. And, you know, you've helped create that person and lifted them up to go on and do the next right thing for them. So I think that mindset, like you said, of being able to celebrate that and see 2 to 3 years as a really positive thing, and actually plan according to that rather than assumption people are going to be with you longer.
Yes. And you have that employee for that period of time, and it was a great, experience for all. They go somewhere else. They continue to learn and grow. Now you have an opportunity back with they could boomerang right back to you. So I think there's like a greater, I think we need to open our minds to the idea that employment doesn't just mean the silo of your company, tunnel vision, that you're really helping a generation grow and develop and become better employees, better leaders that really let everyone win, let everyone benefit from that experience. So I think the world is greater than our companies, is bigger than our companies. I think we need to start thinking about that. How can we contribute to the space of employment for everyone?
I love that. I think it can be incredibly hard though, particularly, for founders that business is their baby, right? And they obviously know the world is greater than them, but it's hard to put that into context when, you've got really aggressive timelines and timeframes, and your leaders are going to be feeling that. They also are passionate about this business they're in. So do you have any advice for how people can start changing their mindset around that? Again, this might be a punchy question asking you to solve the world's problems, but I think it can be a big challenge for people when you're so in the moment of what you're doing to not take these things personally when someone chooses to leave and move on. And maybe we've touched on some of the points that would help, but yeah, any other thoughts or comments on that?
I think for managers, for leaders, I'm putting myself in that situation, and I have multiple generations that I am leading. I think the best thing that a leader can do is really have an eye for how do these generations start to work together and learn from each other. I think that we have, as leaders, as a society, we have been too willing to accept that these generations are so fundamentally different that they're never going to work together cohesively and productively. And then we just accept that and move on. And it becomes like this necessary evil of leading teams. And I don't think that it needs to be that way. I think that a game changer for any manager or leader is to really think about how these generations can work together, can leverage strengths, and to learn from each other. I think, and I've talked about this idea of intergenerational mentorship, that no matter what generation you land in, other generations can learn from your perspective and experience. And experience might be heavier in one generation versus another just based on a timeline. But I think if a leader can really think about that and foster that sort of environment, that can level up your productivity, your performance, your collaboration, teamwork, the vibe. It's going to be completely different.
It's really interesting. And you've mentioned before about, we focus sometimes so much on the differences and not on the similarities. what are those similarities that managers and leaders can lean on to create that kind of environment and culture for their teams?
So I've started reading a book, and I'm going to plug it. It's called Gentelligence, and it is a fascinating book about how to create a workforce that really leverages intergenerational community as a positive and as something that really helps the performance of a company. And so I've started to read this, and they've defined really the 4 values that span generations. And so I can't say it better myself. So this is truly from Gentelligence. So those 4 things are respect, competence, connection, and autonomy. Those 4 values span generations. Every generation is looking for those 4 things in the environment that they work in, their employer. And also recognizing that those 4 values will show up differently, generation to generation. So the idea of, for example, competence. One generation may see somebody kind of leaving me alone. If I know my job, my manager doesn't talk to me very much, and so that to me is a signal that that my competence is valued there. But then for another generation who grew up that was maybe had a lot of involvement, they were constantly getting feedback that they had adults that were telling them, great job, or do this differently. And there was a lot of guidance. Competence might look different for that person in that they will be seeking for someone to validate, yes, you've achieved, yes, you're doing great, yes, you're doing your job. So acknowledging that these values are going to show up differently generation to generation was like light bulb for me. This has to be understood. This has to be thought about in companies, because that can really be the difference in you really understanding the why. And it's so important to understand the why. Why is someone behaving the way that they're behaving? Why is someone looking for what they're looking for? That was huge. And so Gentelligence.
Oh, yeah, I feel like there's so much we could do there. Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I love that. I think it's so nice to have the values that people, collectively believe in and buy into. The bit that I think that you're talking about here then is, what are the behaviors that sit under that? So how does it come to life for those different generations? And I think this is something we often miss when we look at values in any context, is they can be interpreted very differently to different people. So being able to articulate what they mean and how you actually show up with your behaviors to evidence those values, I think is really important. Maybe that's something that, businesses or managers can be thinking about. I think about team charters and things like that. How are you as a team defining how you're going to work? And just through those dialogues and conversations about the values, the behaviors, the principles that you're going to work to, you can maybe bring some of those things to life and say, well, respect might look like this for me, but it might look like that for you. They're both important, and we're going to respect each other's definitions of respect.
Right. And setting the stage, like you mentioned, the team charter it can be so important. And I think also the things that we're talking about are not unreasonable. It's not like we're asking for every company to pay millions of dollars to have all of these robust programs to accommodate what a certain generation needs or wants. These are reasonable things, and they're reasonable things that all generations can benefit from. And so I think everyone is going to fit from these different initiatives and looking at work in this way. And so I think that that's important too, that while you might be putting this in place because you know that a certain generation this might be really appealing to that generation, know that it's appealing to the entire workforce, just maybe at varying degrees.
Really interesting. We've talked as well a bit about some of the challenges that leaders face. We've touched on a few of them here. And I think one of the interesting things you said a moment ago was around the expectations that Gen Z have, that this stuff exists and it's taken seriously. Do you think, because I'm a big fan of transparency as well, do you think if a business is on a journey, which a lot of them are, around their diversity and inclusion, an approach to a lot of these things, probably broader than diversity and inclusion as well, is the best thing just to be dead transparent about where you are. How do you think Gen Z would respond to that? What do you think is the best way for businesses that are on a journey to kind of still try and appeal and be upfront about where they are on that journey?
I mean, transparency is really a huge thing that Gen Z is looking for. They're looking for authenticity and transparency. And so in any way that you can be authentic, where you're truly at, and where you're going and how you're going to get there, as much of that as you can share, I think will appeal to them, because they're expecting transparency and authenticity. If they understand that your culture is, you've created this wonderful message, employer branding, yes, but it's not good employer branding because it's not an accurate reflection of the culture that you actually have. The wonderful thing, and I say wonderful very intentionally, the wonderful thing about Gen Z is if they find that you've not been truthful about what your culture actually is, they will leave you. They will show with their feet that they did not see that what you said you were is actually what you are. And so that is something that I absolutely love about this generation. I think that it really started in that Gen X space, but Gen X and millennials, typically they would be dissatisfied with it, but they were kind of willing to put up with it, put up with the grind, not move with the feet, because it was all they knew. This is just how it is. This is just a job. Gen Z is like, nope, I'm going to figure something else out. I'm going to move for a different employer and I'm going to figure it out. The gig economy is reality for them. They will figure it out. So I just love that about this generation, that they're not beholden to an employer for a certain period of time.
I do think that is really interesting. I think you're right. I've experienced it myself in businesses where people of my own generation, the millennials, who will be happy sitting around and moaning about things, or happily share their distaste at things but not really do much about it. And actually that's all toxic a lot of the time. There's someone just getting up and saying, I don't believe in this, so I'm leaving. So I think it can be, although it can be painful, I think it actually can be beneficial for the business and the individual that they choose to move on if they're not brought in. One of the other things I'm interested in as well, kind of going back to some of the things around stereotypes and maybe just how the generations are moving on and what motivates them. There's been a real focus over the last 10 years or so around purpose-driven work environments. Do you think that's still something that's really important for Gen Z? Is that understanding that purpose and that why behind why we're doing different things?
Yes. I think that they, along with several generations before, they do want to understand their connection to the work that they're doing to meeting business objectives. So as much as you can draw that line as possible, being purpose driven, and this is kind of the ... into how are you contributing to your communities? How are you positively impacting the environment? These are values that Gen Z and millennials too, but that these generations are really looking for. They want to work for a good company. They don't want to, and they want to know where you stand. So in any way that you can communicate that effectively, what you stand for, what your values are, what your culture's about, what are your goals as a company, and where truly are you at in your journey. I think as much as you can share that, the more they're going to see themselves in that environment. And then that's when you get that retention that you're going for, that couple years where they are shining, they are contributing, and you're helping them grow.
Beautiful place. I actually remember the first time I was in a business when someone asked if we were considering becoming a B Corp. And at the time, I didn't know what a B Corp was. This was probably eight or so years ago. And I remember someone I was working with at the time went and had a look at the application form. They were like, oh, well, we're not doing that. That's huge. It'd take us ages. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if their response would be different now. And appreciate it is a big investment of time and energy, but also something that can be really valuable, not just as, but in terms of setting out who you are as a business and what you stand for. I think it's an interesting one. Super. Well, right, we've covered so much stuff, and I think there's loads more we could dig into, but I would love to know if you've got examples of businesses that have approached attracting and retaining Gen Z effectively, and kind of what they did that made it work well for them.
So, when you read articles, you see great things about Microsoft, great things about Salesforce, where they've really, really invested in creating a culture that has an eye for the things that I've mentioned. And thinking on a little bit smaller scale, I just had a conversation with someone who was fresh out of college, and they were in an early career program with a benefit broker here, Hub. And he was talking about how much he has learned and how much he is seen by that company, because they recognize that coming out of college and you're learning the insurance industry, which exciting stuff. But they've created this environment that allows him to not only learn the industry, learn the products, learn all of that, but also learn kind of what it means to be a new employee in the world. And what does that look like? And he just said nothing but good things about that program. And so that's a perfect example to me of a career development program that is very meaningful. And I got to tell, I really felt like he was connected to that company, that he saw the contribution that company was making in his life and in his journey. And so he was a raving fan. And employee advocacy is such a big part of when you think about how you're going to attract employees. Word of mouth continues to put all of the other strategies to shame, and also tapping into the fact that this generation is very well connected. And so if they like something, they are going to post about it. They're going to have an audience of who knows how many people looking at how much this person loves his job. You better believe you're going to have people that think, oh, I want to be a part of that. I mean, it's such an incredible grassroots, incredibly inexpensive way to get in front of your target audience and say, I'm supporting you. I have some great things going on. You might want to look at what jobs we have available. I mean, it was such it really was a great conversation. I learned a lot from him. And so Hub,
awesome.
Thumbs up.
That's really, Hub. Really great to hear. And I think you just made me think, actually, we haven't touched on social media at all. But again, I feel like that could be a whole nother podcast in its own. But I think you're right, that awareness that people do post this stuff. We've all seen stuff with the layoffs as well, of people recording those and sharing them. But if you can use that to your strength, then more power to you. Super. Exactly. So a couple more questions. What kind of is your top advice or 3 takeaways that you'd want people to take from this conversation, people managers and leaders?
Well, I think first, just accepting that Gen Z is the future of your business. This is your workforce that's coming into your environment. And so how do you tap into those strengths? How do you appeal to that generation is really going to be pivotal for you to attract the people that you want to attract. I think also, what are you offering and how are you communicating it to your potential workforce? What differentiators do you have, and how is that going to appeal to your future workforce? I think is really important. And I think third would be, how do you really tap into the different strengths of across generations and getting those teams to work together, I think is awesome. Key.
No, that's super. Thank you. You mentioned the book that you've been reading, which we'll add a link to in the description here. But is there anything else, any other reading or books that you would recommend people check out?
So I don't The Gentelligence is the one that I'm focusing on right now. I'm really geeking out on generational, just learning about the generations, learning about how they show up in the workforce, and really breaking down those barriers between the generations, acknowledging that there are more similarities between the generations and there are differences. And because it seems that like we talk very freely about generations and their positives and their negatives, and it really is a bias, right? It is the last accepted bias that we talk about freely. If we were to apply this to any other class of people or category of people, that would be incredibly taboo. And yet we just spout generational stereotypes like it's the easiest thing in the world. And so I think I'm just really interested in learning more about how we
I think that
we fix
do you know
that.
what, when you put it like that, I'm starting to question myself a lot, but I think it's a really important problem to solve, because we're talking about Gen Z, but this is not hopefully the world's not going to end tomorrow, and this is going to be an ongoing thing that people are going to have to keep thinking about as our generations evolve. So so my last question to you is,
yes,
if we could cover any other topic on this podcast or have anyone on here, what would be of interest to you? What would you love to hear us talk about?
I'm really interested in this. I mean, it's kind of a point in time right now, but it feels as if there are a lot of people looking for jobs, a lot of people available for jobs, and also a lot of employers looking for people. So how do those two things exist? So I think some sort of deep dive in the workforce dynamic, the skills that are out there or lack of skills, and how that can be figured out. I think the AI component is a really, I mean, obviously the topic. And I did read something that said that 71% of managers, I want to say 71% of managers would be willing to, or were interested in hiring someone with less experience, but better AI skills than the other way around. And I think that is a huge, huge statement, that you can have less experience and less qualifications in a job, but if you know how to leverage AI, hiring manager is interested in you as a candidate. I think that's fascinating. So any part of that,
that's really interesting, how we view what's important to us. And also, gosh, I don't want to dig into it too much now, but how do you build a team around you? I think for me, that's a real positive, that people identify that's a skill they don't have and they want to hire that in. But I'm sure there'll be a load of complexity around that in terms of what you're compromising for that. So yes, definitely an interesting topic that I will do my best to find someone to speak on for us. So thank you, Amy. It's been really, really lovely, and lots of really interesting areas for us to think about more.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.